Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back once again to the Siege of Vraks, which is, unfortunately for the Death Corps at least, starting to turn into less of a siege and more of a running battle across the Vraksian surface. With the defeat of the 101st Regiment and therefore the continued advance of the Chaos Horde that landed, quote-unquote, along with the Aron's Bane, the encirclement of the Vraksian citadel was now not only in danger, but in all due likelihood entirely untenable. Previously, it had been the Death Corps of Krieg that had attempted to cut off and encircle Vraksian traitors as they fell back from the various defensive lines. But now it was the Death Corps' turn to carry out a somewhat desperate retreat. The 1st Line Corps would have to abandon their positions and move westwards swiftly. If the Line Corps did not react immediately, there was a very real danger that its connection to the 30th Line Corps on their western flank would be severed, therefore leaving the entirety of the 1st Line Corps trapped between the advancing forces from the Aron's Bane and, additionally, troops from the Vraksian 3rd Line of defences, who were sensing weakness and were attempting to break through and link up with the incoming Chaos forces. If this was allowed to happen, then the 1st Line Corps would be trapped between these forces, the 3rd Defensive Line, and the Deimos Trench to their rear and south. And if this was allowed to happen, there would be no rescuing the 1st Line Corps. Both of the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army's assault corps were fully occupied with maintaining the relative integrity of the front line, and neither the 8th or the 11th would have the strength or even, indeed, the opportunity to launch a rescue mission. And if indeed no rescue mission could be launched, then it would be merely a question of time until the 1st Line Corps was fully eradicated. The Death Corps of Krieg may be among some of the staunchest, most loyal, disciplined, and stubborn fighting men in the galaxy, but even they require supplies, ammunition, food, water, and all of the various elements that an army requires to remain functional. And once cut off from the rest of the 88th Siege Army, those things would simply no longer be available to the 1st Line Corps. Therefore, the only solution was to pull the Line Corps out of the way of the incoming Chaos forces before it was too late. This, however, was going to require some sacrifices. Whilst the 101st Regiment had succeeded in slowing the Chaos forces at least to a certain, albeit small degree, it was nowhere even remotely close to enough to effect a full-scale and safe evacuation of the 1st Line Corps. And if an evacuation was attempted without the proper degree of organisation, that could just as easily lead to the disintegration of the 1st Line Corps as simply leaving them to be surrounded. It was therefore necessary to select another regiment to throw at the incoming Chaos Hordes, in a rearguard role. However, unlike the 101st Regiment, which had attempted to do something along the same lines, this regiment would not be authorized to withdraw. Its objective was quite simply to place itself straight in the path of the incoming Chaos Army and stand there until annihilated. In the process, it was hoped, and indeed relied upon, that they would purchase enough time with their lives for the 1st Line Corps to effect an ordered and speedy withdrawal. And alongside the movements of the 1st Line Corps, the 30th Line Corps would also be shuffling its front line around. Whilst the 19th Siege Regiment went to meet the incoming Chaos forces, and the 3rd, 5th and 15th moved westwards to occupy the positions previously held by the 30th Line Corps, the 30th would begin moving northwards to establish a new northern defensive line to prevent the Chaos invaders from sweeping around the 88th Siege Army's flank. In preparation for this move, the 30th Line Corps was also reinforced by what remained of the 11th Assault Corps, without, of course, the 101st Regiment, which was still gathering itself up after its defeat at the hands of the Chaos invaders. They would receive these reinforcements because it was of course vital for this line to hold no matter what. If the 30th Line Corps' new front line was breached in any way, shape or form, it would allow the Chaos Forces to flood through yet again and threaten the rearward areas of the 1st Line Corps and in turn every Line Corps on the planet, leading, quite possibly, to the defeat of the entire 88 Siege Army. It was a desperate move, but also a necessary move. Desperate times breed desperate measures, as they say. The 30th Line Corps would have to abandon their own positions piece by piece and hand them over to the 1st Line Corps. This in and of itself was a difficult operation, as they would have to do so oftentimes whilst under attack from enemy forces. However, they could not simply just move the 1st Line Corps through the 30th and have them head northwards, as the 1st Line Corps would almost certainly be disorganized from their sudden withdrawal. The various elements of their regiments would almost certainly come out of order, and it was a real possibility that local command might even break down entirely in certain areas, as their withdrawal would also have to take place under continuous enemy assault. It was therefore judged to be far more realistic and practical to move the 30th Line Corps' regiments out of the line piecemeal and replace them with whatever elements of the 1st Line Corps could reach them first. In this fashion, the ordered and organized troops of the 30th Line Corps could be moved northwards in a controlled fashion, where they could also engage in combat with the Chaos Invader immediately. And in the worst case scenario, assuming a breakup of the 3 remaining regiments in the 1st Line Corps, the shattered remains could then take up prepared defensive positions from which they would have an advantage of their attackers. There was, however, one very clear downside to all of this. The 1st Line Corps was now essentially out of the fight. If they could be moved, hopefully, into new positions, they would have to reorganize themselves for weeks, possibly even months. Additionally, the 30th Line Corps would be fully engaged in digging, preparing, and defending their new positions. And finally, the 11th Assault Corps would also be fully engaged in supporting the 1st and the 30th, and ensuring that any potential breakthroughs could be stymied immediately. And this was, as mentioned, of vital importance. Any breakthrough at this point could very easily herald the end of the entire army. This meant then that 2 full line corps and an assault corps, in addition to various artillery companies, were all fully committed just to holding the line, whilst the other line corps were still desperately attempting to reorganize and reassert their own front lines. The war on Vraks held in a delicate balance, and that was assuming that this operation was successful, and no additional breakthroughs were achieved by the chaotic forces. The best case scenario the Death Corps could hope for now was a stabilization of the situation, and any hope of bringing the war to a successful conclusion within the original deadline was well and truly gone. At this point, bringing the war to a successful conclusion at all was looking like a less and less likely prospect. And that simple fact had not escaped the attention of the ones who were ultimately responsible for the campaign on Vraks. Now that Lord Commander Julka had been sacked, it was up to the Lord Militant Obscurus and his command staff, who were in direct contact with the High Lords of Terror, to decide upon who would take over the Lord Commander's duties. And they had best decide quickly, because at the moment the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army was effectively without a higher command structure. And if the campaign was to fail, which at the moment looked frighteningly likely, then all of the responsibility for that failure would fall squarely upon the head of the Lord Militant Obscurus, as, of course, as mentioned previously, Lord Commander Julka had enough in the way of political standing to quite neatly sidestep any fallout from the disaster that was apparently unfolding on Vraks in this very moment. And there were plenty of people that were all too willing to leap upon the Lord Militant Obscurus a moment of weakness, denouncing in the most strident terms the Departamento Munitorum's handling of the war up until this point. For example, there was a certain official on the cardinal world of San Arturius. The cardinal astrals of the sector claimed that the failure on Vraks was entirely due to a lack of faith. If only the war had been executed more in line with the Adeptus Ministorum's doctrines, the war would have been brought to a successful conclusion years ago, they argued. Because ultimately failure came down to an error in prioritization. They would have conducted a holy crusade to retake the defiled Basilica of St. Leonis and bring the renegade cardinal to justice. If only these objectives had been at the heart of the war effort, there would have been no problems. The fact that the retaking of the Basilica and the capture of the Cardinal would necessarily include the capturing of the Citadel, which was the army's primary objective, well, you know, it's all a question of priorities and definitions, isn't it? And clearly, the retaking of the Citadel was not the correct holy verbiage to ensure success, as any true faithful could clearly see. But, of course, the God Emperor's Holy Church is not a vengeful entity, nor is it a petty entity. It is a generous and benevolent entity which stands ready to provide its own forces in the form of military aid, resources, and political pull to salvage the situation on Vraks. And all they ask in return for this aid was a mere pittance, a minor detail that might as well be entirely overlooked when considering the gravity of the situation. Indeed, this small thing, this minor favour indeed, was merely that the ecclesiarchy elect the new leader on Vraks, someone with the correct sense of faith and duty, and correct political alignment, of course. Immediately, the Lord Militant Obscurus pointed out to the ecclesiarchy that this, unfortunately, was not possible. No disrespect meant, of course, but the ecclesiarchy could not be put at the head of any body of fighting men due to, once again, ancient edicts. However, the sneaky little clergyman had an answer to this. In fact, they had been counting upon this particular objection, as they then brought to the Lord Militant Obscurus' attention that they had the full sanction of the Inquisition's Ordo Hereticus, who had offered to put their own inquisitors at the head of every single regiment of the 88th Siege Army, and therefore conduct the entire army into the ranks of the Inquisition. That was one fuck of a political move. The Inquisition was essentially lobbying through the ecclesiarchy to take full command over the entirety of the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army in one fell swoop, and remove it from the jurisdiction of the Departamento Munitorum and fully integrate it into the God Emperor's Inquisition. Now, this is technically within the Inquisition's power, but this would normally be considered one fuck of an overreach, even by inquisitorial standards, by the High Lords of Terra. One could even, at the risk of sounding a wee bit heretical, suggest that the Inquisition had an alternate objective in all of this. Say, by inducting a few million veteran Krieg guardsmen into their own ranks for some, as of yet, undisclosed purpose and or reason. Well, again, this is technically within the Inquisition's power, but It is generally understood that whenever an Inquisitor takes command over Imperial Guard forces, that they eventually relinquish that command, in case an Inquisitor goes a little bit cuckoo, which of course never happens, obviously, except for when it does happen. So again, the High Lords of Terror would almost certainly be a little bit worried by this. And worried would turn out to be a bit of an understatement, as the High Lord of the Departmentum Munitorium immediately and vehemently vetoed the idea, and demanded that the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army must remain under administratum control, and that it was their lines of supply and their materials that was feeding the war, and if the Ordo Hereticus or the Ecclesiarchy were in any way, shape or form going to push this point, then the Ordo Hereticus and the Ecclesiarchy should take into consideration just how many accidents and delays can occur when one is dealing with interplanetary supply routes. Of course, this wasn't a threat or anything, this was merely a suggestion from the High Lord of the Administratum to dot their I's and make sure they had taken into consideration the potential delays involved in such a complex logistical task. Because, after all, as we all know, accidents do occasionally happen, and they can happen with frightening frequency if you piss off the wrong people. And thusly, with his arse suitably covered by the Departmentum Munitorum, the Lord Militant Obscurus took it upon himself to appoint the next commander of the 88th Army. Now, this would be a difficult decision to make. With so many powerful political forces lobbying for their own candidates, compromises would almost certainly have to be made. In the end, the Lord Militant Obscurus reserved the right for himself to appoint the final Lord Commander. However, the most vocal and powerful detractors would be allowed to either join his command staff in person or appoint their own representatives to join the General Staff. This most certainly did not make everybody happy, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it was enough to not interfere directly with the Lord Militant's final pick for the commander. However, said commander would be under immense pressure to deliver results immediately. He would not enjoy the same kind of laid-back command structure as the Lord Commander Julka had. If results were not produced immediately, then all of the various interested and very powerful political parties involved would immediately begin dividing the blame, and heaping as much of it as possible onto the reigning Lord Commander, with the goal, of course, of replacing him with their own candidates. The new Lord Commander would not only have to fight the Vraxians, but also a considerable portion of the Imperium's upper political elites. Doesn't necessarily sound like the dream job, does it? Some of the more skeptical elements amongst you, the audience, might even refer to it as a poisoned chalice, but there were still opportunities to be had. If the commander in question managed to turn the situation around, that would be a considerable feat and almost certainly guarantee said commander a place in Imperial history books. Great quantities of glory, honor, and the rewards usually associated with these two ever so ephemeral quantities. Of course, first the situation would have to be turned around, naturally, and that was not going to be an easy task. And whilst the rewards might sound tempting, the consequences for failure could be great as well, considering that two of the principal political forces in opposition to the new commander would be the Ecclesiarchy and the Ordo Hereticus. The outcome of this political maneuvering will probably be the subject of next video. For now, we have some worries closer to home to deal with, namely the 19th Regiment, the rearguard formation whose aim it was to delay the enemy's advance for long enough to allow the rest of the 1st Line Corps to escape relatively unmolested, and thusly ensure that there would actually be an 88th Imperial Guard siege army for the Adeptus Ministorum, Administratum, or Inquisition to take command over. The operation had started with the 19th Siege Regiment utilizing companies of Death Riders and infantry formations to attack and therefore draw the attention of the Chaos Forces. The commander of the 19th Siege Regiment knew, of course, that he and his men were doomed, but such knowledge has never had overmuch in the way of effect upon the guardsmen of Krieg. And so the regiment set about their assigned task with all the vigour they could muster. First and foremost, it was necessary to create the illusion that the 1st Line Corps intended to stay and fight. To do this, the 19th Siege Regiment sent out Death Rider companies and infantry formations to attack the advancing Chaos Forces. These small units would launch long-range attacks upon the Chaos formation, after which they would immediately fall back to prepared positions. The Death Corps, of course, having fought over this ground for nearly a decade, had a near-perfect understanding of the terrain, something the Chaos invaders lacked. Every time the invaders followed these flea-bite attacks, they would run headfirst into prepared ambush positions and suffer heavy casualties. This process would then be repeated over and over and over again, drawing in yet further Chaos forces every time the strategy was a success. In essence, the Death Corps of Krieg were turning the Vraksian defenders' tactics upon their brand new allies, drawing them into the teeth of yet new defensive positions every time they made a move. Utilizing this strategy, they managed to trick the Chaos forces into thinking that there was a far larger formation of Death Corps guardsmen still within the pocket, and they dragged off more and more Chaos elements. Those forces that were not occupied with dealing with the movement of the 30th Line Corps and the retreat of the 1st were all moving towards the 19th, which gave the remnants of the 1st Line Corps enough time to successfully evacuate, and also purchased enough time for the 30th Line Corps and the 11th Assault Corps to establish their own defensive positions, whilst the 19th slowly but surely fell back and back and back, until finally they established their last set of defensive positions with their backs to the deep sets of gorges behind them. Gorges that the 19th Siege Regiment simply had no way of crossing. But they could be content in the fact that they had carried out their mission. The 1st Line Corps had successfully evacuated itself, and the 30th Line Corps had also been able to establish its new positions. The 19th had done all that could be asked of it, and all that remained now was for a glorious last stand that could go down proudly in the Death Corps' history. Unfortunately, there were certain forces on the traitors' side that looked to deny them this final honour. Because you see, as I have alluded to previously, the arrival of these reinforcements had quite abruptly and severely shifted the balance of power for the traitors as well. Preceding their arrival, the highest authority naturally resided with the Cardinal. He was the de facto spiritual, military, and indeed overall leader of all elements of Vraksian society, its army, its religious services, its administration, etc., etc. He was the Alpha and the Omega. With the arrival of Lord Arcos's Alpha Legion Space Marines, this had shifted somewhat, but Arcos had contented himself with merely becoming the Cardinal's closest advisor, muscling out many of his previous advisors, amongst them, of course, the good Deacon Mamoon. However, Arcos had never sought to usurp the Cardinal's control over Vraks. These new arrivals, however, had considerably less respect, shall we say, for the Cardinal's position. as far as many of them were concerned, the Cardinal was naught but an upstart corpse worshipper, not worthy of their respect, and even less so, their consideration in matters of tactics or strategy. Chief amongst them was the cornered warlord Zufur, who fancied himself the leader of these new Chaos forces, and he saw absolutely no reason whatsoever why he should take instructions from a mere mortal. The only one who could possibly have swayed the cornered warlord in any real way, although an extraordinarily minor way, mind you, would have been Lord Arkos, but he was nowhere to be found. Lord Arkos and his Alpha Legion warband appears to have left the Citadel. They could still be found out in the field roaming around uncontrolledly and in no way in communication with the Cardinal like the other warbands, but if he had any intention of utilizing what little influence he might have over the other warbands, then he certainly gave no indication of it. Fortunately, for the time being at least, the various Chaos warbands were too busy with their own agendas to pay overmuch in the way of attention to the Cardinal's forces, except for a few of them. The first to land upon the surface of Vraks were the blood-maddened followers of Khorne, who had, true to form, simply thrown themselves into the fight. Shortly thereafter came the Iron Warriors, who spearheaded the armoured thrust against the joint between the 30th and the 1st Line Corps. After that, they had simply made themselves comfortable in the Vraxian defensive lines. And if the previous occupants of the Iron Warriors' new bunker homes were stupid enough to protest, well, casualties happen all the time, and judging by the remains, they must have been hit by artillery, right? What else could possibly pulp a human body quite so thoroughly? Odd that it happened indoors, of course, but, well, who am I to question it? The third and final group of warbands, arriving well after all the others and declining to take part in the initial engagements, were the various warbands who followed Nurgle, the Plague God. They had landed well after everyone else and had, as mentioned, simply ignored the fighting, choosing instead to head directly for the inner defensive line and the Vraxian Citadel. More specifically, the various armories located in and around the Citadel. Somehow, the worshippers of Nurgle had gotten wind of, pun intended, that amongst the vast stockpiles of weapons, ammunition, and vehicles, there were also weapons of a more pleasing nature, at least as far as Grandfather Nurgle was concerned. Vast stockpiles of experimental chemical and biological weapons. So far, the Cardinal had held these weapons in reserve, fearing that if he were to unleash them upon the Death Corps, whose reputation across the galaxy is well known, would simply just begin responding in kind. Which undoubtedly was another reason why the Death Corps themselves had not employed overmuch in the way of chemical or biological agents. Both sides, of course, used gas weaponry, but they were of a mild nature, a gentle type of gas, at least compared to what was hidden away in the various storage bunkers beneath Vraks. Of particular interest to the worshippers of Nurgle was a substance called trimethylene petholoxic tertius, commonly referred to as TP3. TP3 was a horrible or ingenious, depending upon your standpoint, combination of highly acidic and corrosive heavy gases. TP3 had originally been designed, ironically enough, to be a siege breaker weapon. Originally, TP3 had shown great promise in fulfilling this role. The peculiar nature of the weapon meant that it could simply just eat its way through most gas masks and common defensive measures, rendering them essentially worthless as a protective measure. After the gas had eaten its way through whatever gas filters the soldier might be carrying, death would follow within 30 seconds, as the highly corrosive gas inflicted horrifying damage upon the human respiratory system. Additionally, if deployed in strong enough concentrations, TP3 could eat its way through literal armoured plating. This not only meant that TP3 would be able to penetrate hardened bunkers, it would also eat straight through any armour or clothing that the exposed soldiers might be wearing, and then begin melting flesh and bone beneath it. These were of course all highly sought after attributes in a gas-based weapon, and TP3 was accepted for deployment, however, not for general deployment. The peculiar nature of the chemical's heavy acidic gases meant that it was extraordinarily volatile. The weapon had to be deployed for maximum efficiency in vast quantities and high concentrations, and if any errors were made during the deployment process and the gas began to pool in friendly trenches, it would simply just remain there. With no way of getting rid of it, it would begin decimating the very troops that had attempted to deploy it against the enemies. And due again to its peculiar corrosive nature, there was very little in the way of defense against it. Additionally, it was not a weapon that could be utilized for shock value. Whilst the weapon itself was more than able to inflict substantial casualties upon enemy trench systems, again, the nature of the heavy gases meant that it would infect no man's land for many, many hours, and depending upon conditions, possibly days or even weeks after its deployment. It would almost certainly clear out the enemy's trench lines, but if Imperial forces did not have access to specialized troops with enough in the way of armor to protect themselves against the gas, then no advance could be carried out across no man's land without incurring heavy casualties amongst the attackers as well. These drawbacks meant that TP3, as far as the Imperium was concerned, was a highly specialized weapon, only to be deployed in very special circumstances and only be used to achieve very special objectives. But as far as the followers of Nurgle were concerned, these drawbacks were not drawbacks at all. In fact, they were merely the icing on top of the putrid and spoiled cake. And instead of asking the Cardinal if they could please, oh pretty please, be given access to these weapons, they simply just broke their way into the armories in which they were stored, butchering the guards if they were foolish enough to resist, and stole them right from underneath the apostate Cardinal's nose. All that remained then was to find a suitable target to receive Grandfather's blessings. And, luckily, such a target had kindly presented itself just a few days previously, and had also kindly isolated itself from the rest of the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army. After all, it would be no fun if one's test subjects could simply just run away, would it? The 19th Siege Regiment was about to experience a drastic change in the nature of their opposition. Up until this point, they had been hemmed in by the Cardinal's forces, who now found themselves being evicted from their own positions by the followers of Nurgle. And anyone foolish enough to resist, well, I'm sure at this point you can imagine the consequences of such foolish actions. Meanwhile, the 19th did not suspect anything about what was about to hit them. Up until this point, the siege of Vraks had been fought with, well, a degree of civility, I suppose I would say. Not a term I think would really be applicable in most circumstances, but certain rules had been followed. None of the experimental weapons kept beneath the citadel had been used against the besiegers, and in turn, the besiegers had not employed any particularly vicious weapons against the defenders either. Whilst civility might be too strong of a word, there had been a certain accord on both sides. That accord was now broken, as the Death Guard unleashed the TP3 gas upon the 19th Regiment. Luckily for the defenders, the worshippers of Nurgle were still relatively unfamiliar with this weapon, and as such, only in certain areas did it reach sufficient concentration to unleash its true devastating potential. In these areas of the 19th's front lines, entire sections of trenches were turned into stinking, fetid swamps, in which humans, gas masks, metal, weaponry, and even the duckboards upon which they stood all melted together in one disgusting, fetid mass. In these areas, men died in unbelievable agonies as their weapons, their armor, their very clothing began melting and running off them in molten rivers. Shortly thereafter, their hair, their skin, their organs would begin liquefying, and they would die in unimaginable agony. In the areas in which the gas coalesced fully, all life was simply snuffed out. Even the improvised dugouts and bunkers offered absolutely no protection against the TP3 gas. In other areas where the gas had failed to gather in sufficient quantities, the specially treated uniforms of the Death Corps Guardsmen stood up well to the TP3 gas, preventing any real damage to the Guardsmen who wore them. In these areas, the Death Guard would find resistance was still strong as they advanced across no man's land aboard putrid, boil-ridden land raiders and rhinos. The Death Guard disembarked from their vehicles and began their slow, measured approach towards the trenches, never advancing faster than a walking pace, whilst firing their bolters on full auto every step of the way with flawless, machine-like precision. And against these bloated monstrosities, not even what would usually fell a Chaos Space Marine had any effect. Heavy bolter rounds would penetrate their armor and explode within their bodies, showering the nearby area with globules of innards and disgusting, stinking guts, and yet the Death Guard would simply just continue walking at the very same measured walking pace as previously, only shifting his fire ever so slightly to hose down the heavy bolter position that had so recently injured him. Even the Death Guard were of course not completely impervious to damage, but it required a lot of putting down. The various infantry formations quickly realized that their Lucius pattern lasguns were virtually useless against the Death Guard, preferring instead to utilize melter or plasma guns whenever available, using the other infantry troopers armed with Lucius patterns simply to blind or distract the enemy for long enough for their specialist weapons to get into position. Unfortunately, whilst the Death Guards may certainly have bargained away their souls, they still retained all of their tactical experience from their lives as legionnaires during the Great Crusade, and this tactic only met with success once out of every 10 times attempted. The assault had begun at dawn, and now that the sun had well and truly risen, desperate fighting was raging across the 19th Regiment's front lines. The Death Corps Guardsmen found themselves horribly outmatched by the Death Guard. Their Lucius pattern lasguns were of little use against their rotted plating, and even were their bayonets to find a chink in the armor or sink all the way up to the handguard in soft, yielding putrid flesh, the wound would not faze the Marine in the slightest. Nevertheless, the Death Corps had the numbers over the Death Guard, and slowly but surely they were beginning to contain their break-ins. In the areas of the front line where the gas had done its horrid work, they had begun throwing up containment areas, moving into place heavy bolters, las cannons, and other heavy weaponry to stop the advance of the Death Guard. Unfortunately, they did not merely have the Death Guard to contend with. Now that the sun had fully risen, the second wave of attackers began moving. Hordes upon hordes of putrid, near-dead cultists began to walk slowly and hesitantly across the landscape. Many would find only death waiting for them in no man's land, as Death Corps blocking artillery hammered down amongst their midst. Others would stumble into craters still filled with concentrations of TP3 and be dissolved as they screamed their curses up to an uncaring sky. Thousands more would die cut down by disciplined volleys of lasgun fire, or torn apart by heavy bolters and autocannons. But even so, tens of thousands more would begin to swarm into the Death Corps' lines. Wherever the Death Guard had managed to gain a foothold, they would swarm in their hundreds, like ants crawling over the mound of what was to become the 19th Siege Regiment's grave. By midday, the enemy was in possession of over a fourth of the regiment's defensive holdings. By nighttime, that had grown to a half. Next morning, the commander of the 19th Siege Regiment voxed his superiors and told them that he would be able to hold out for no more than one more day. His last few artillery positions were now firing over open sights against advancing Death Guard elements. His tanks in hull-down positions were being swarmed by cultists, and his trenches were being collapsed by land raiders. And just to make things a tiny little bit worse, because remember, things can always get worse, the Death Guard's efforts had drawn the attention of their patron deity. Not only was the TP3 gas still lingering in certain areas of the front line, the blessings of Lord Nurgle and the continued exposure to the Death Guard's blight grenades and their very own corrupting, warping presence was beginning to have an effect on reality itself. The ground was bleeding, thick, putrid greenish blood. Maggots were beginning to swarm out from what was previously healthy wood supporting the trenches. The captain's own command bunker had been rendered inhabitable previously that night, as suddenly thick brown water started leaking from the walls and fat white wriggling maggots began digging their way out of the dirt floor. That was the final report ever received from the 19th Siege Regiment. In a little under 48 hours, the entire formation had been wiped out. Now, we do not know exactly what strength the regiment was at during the beginning of the incursion. They had almost certainly been weakened after the Great Offensive, and after their repeated spoiling attacks against the Chaos Invaders, they had almost certainly been weakened yet further. But if we were to assume that the regiment was at round about half strength, then this would mean that something along the lines of 60,000 Krieg guardsmen had been wiped out in the span of 48 hours. If one were to take into consideration the other casualties suffered by the rest of the 88th Siege Army after the arrival of the Chaos reinforcements and their desperate efforts to re-establish an organized front line, that number would increase drastically. The army had already been savaged during the long, vicious, grinding success of the Great Offensive. Some reinforcement had reached them, but by all accounts, that offensive had cost the army 1 million casualties, if not more. This latest bout of fighting may very well have cost them anywhere between 500,000 to 1 million more. When the dust would finally settle, and the 88th Army's on-planet command finally had a moment to take stock of their casualties, they would no doubt count themselves exceedingly lucky if they would be able to marshal as much as half of the starting strength of the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army. Luckily, the beleaguered warriors of Krieg could count on at least a small period of respite. The various Chaos commanders, now that the initial bout of offensives were over with, now had more important issues at hand. Figuring out their own command hierarchy, for example, and making sure that the various other warlords were fully aware of exactly where in that new hierarchy they would fit. Cardinal Zaphrin might be willing to overlook the actions of the Nurgle worshippers, but Cornet Warlord Zephyr most certainly was not willing to extend that same courtesy. The various commanders of the Nurgle warband were amicable to their chastisement, unusually so, one might think, but their experiment had been a success. Their actions against the 19th Regiment proved that they could affect the environment of Vraks in manners that were most pleasing to Grandfather Nurgle, and if they would have to fall in line for a short period of time now to continue their experiments tomorrow, then so be it. They, after all, had far grander goals in mind than the mere winning of a small, insignificant war. They were here to change the very nature of Vraks as a planet. They were here to offer it up to their ever-loving deity. And to do so, they required yet more time, undisturbed by the petty and unpious political machinations of their less favoured brethren. And with that, in the name of the jolly old grandfather, I will bid you adieu once again. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much so for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon with more from the Vraksian front. Until then, have a good day.